Security and return on investment. From a security standpoint, obviously the transparency of open source code gives us a secure solution, but then also tools like Red Hat's enterprise security package that you can add on to Red Hat Linux makes it a much more secure system than a lot of the proprietary operating systems. And then as far as return on investment, I think that obviously it's clear that the cost of open source software is almost always lower than proprietary, not only at the purchase time, but also on license renewals and for maintenance. And then on top of that, support, because it's actually a very competitive market in support in open source. And so we find that a lot of times support is lower cost in open source model. The obvious answer is operating systems and often middleware, but there's so many other things. Really open source, essentially anything that you can get in proprietary is available in the open source market. Things like CMSs, virtualization, mobility, and any of the tools along those lines come to mind. I think a good example would be the Army, who surprisingly is one of the biggest users of open source systems. And not only the ones that I listed, but the Army also utilizes modeling and simulation and video indexing and things along those lines. And you can really actually point to every government agency, every cabinet level department in the U.S. government is using open source in some form or fashion in production environments. I think the easy answer to that one is big data. Big data and NoSQL, things along those lines are really becoming a trend that we're going to see, I think, throughout 2013 and leading into 2014. Companies like Red Hat, obviously, but also Cloudera and Squirrel are leading the path into big data, and they're going to give us a lot of solutions that you're not going to find in the proprietary areas. Also, I can point to the U.S. CIO's 25-point implementation plan to reform federal information technology management. That plan lists a lot of things in there, obviously, that are going to be trends and predictions for the future. The funny thing is open source isn't mentioned in that entire document. The words don't come up even once. But it's alluded to a number of times, not the least of which is data center consolidation, and then also cloud first. I think that you'll see trends in those areas. Both of those are going to be huge in 2013, along with some of the other points that are listed there. First thing that comes to mind is that you should keep an open mind, no pun intended. Obviously, a lot of people just have always believed that proprietary software was better or more secure or whatever. Now that myth's been demystified, I think that it's important that we do keep an open mind as we look at software and realize that it's not only proprietary or open source. There's a lot of other options. There are hybrid systems where we can architect a system that's made up of both in different varying degrees. Also, one big piece of advice that I have would be to not be afraid to ask for advice. Companies like Emergent will stretch the boundaries for you. We have so much extreme experience with open source and architecting systems and stuff along those lines that you almost have to, in this day and age, ask for advice. There's so many different options and so many different ways to go. Like I mentioned, hybrid systems. Sometimes it can be pretty complicated and complex. Another thing that would be really good for you is to review websites. Wikipedia site obviously comes to mind, but also ODNI has a really good standards document on open source and its usage. And then there's also opensource.com and several other sites. Obviously, Google's a great resource for that. Just make sure that you pick and choose through the stuff that you're reading and make sure that you read several different sources for this information. Finally, I would just say that just because software is free, you shouldn't think that it's open source. There's a big difference there. Sometimes there'll be things like web browsers, a perfect example. Almost all web browsers are free, but very few web browsers are open source. So Microsoft's Internet Explorer is a perfect example. It's a free web browser, but it's proprietary. The code is not transparent, and it's not open source. And then Google Chrome is another option, but it's not open source either. It's actually called partial because it's based on Chromium, which is an open source platform, but then they have their own add-in features which are proprietary, which make it partial. So it's half open source and then half proprietary. A really good one to point at that's open source would be something along the lines of Mozilla Firefox. Any number of these things will work for you, and you should definitely do that. But my advice would be to do your due diligence before jumping into either of the arenas, open source or proprietary code. We work with a lot of different agencies. Some of our major work that we're doing is with DISA, the Navy, the United States Marine Corps. We also work with the Department of Energy. Almost all of our projects in open source are Red Hat based, and it would be operating systems. We also do a lot of work with Rev, the virtualization platform that Red Hat has, and then obviously JBoss on the middleware side.